Hi everyone, Professor Bowen here with some comments on our Week 9 discussion of the Black Death. One of the things that we spent a fair amount of time talking about last week was Michael Dols' classic 1977 essay on Christian and Muslim responses to the Black Death. And in our evaluations of this, quite a few of us drew attention to certain, shall we say, problematic features of this piece. Some of us saw it as a poor example of comparative historical scholarship, and we found fault with the way that Dols emphasized European disunity, the way he overlooked the views of doctors, specifically Islamic doctors, who thought that the plague was contagious, and also how he presented Christianity and Islam as monolithic faiths without any internal dissensions, tensions, or diversity. These are really, really excellent points, and in this video, I'd like to build on them by showcasing a number of more recent historical accounts of the Black Death in the Middle East. Like many of you, these historians that we're going to learn about also contend that Michael Dols' portrayal of things is rather simplistic and reductionist. Many begin by questioning the way Dols foregrounds religion as a determining factor in social responses to the plague. As some of us noted, Dols, interestingly, never really set out to examine what religion's influence on people's understandings of and reactions to the Black Death was. Indeed, the idea that religion was a driving force in both Muslim and Christian responses to the plague is something that he takes for granted. This is an unspoken assumption governing his analysis. And as such, we might ask, how valid of an assumption is it? Was there actually a connection between responses to the plague and religious belief anywhere? These are some of the key questions animating Justin Stern's 2011 book, Infectious Ideas: Contagion in Pre-Modern Islamic and Christian Thought in the Western Mediterranean. Were there really community divisions between Muslims and Christians? And were the differences in the respective responses of these societies to the plague ultimately reducible to theological differences? In his book, Stearns pokes a lot of holes in Dols. He makes the important point that Islamic cultures were not a monolith, and that the lands of Dar al-Islam were filled with lots of interfaith communities that themselves were incredibly varied in their responses to the Black Death. As we've seen, this is one of the pitfalls of comparative history, and it's one that Michael Dols succumbs to. That is, tending to treat the things you're comparing as different, when in fact there may be many similarities and lots of interconnections between them. In his comparison, Dols goes so far as to say that Christian and Muslim responses to the plague reveal, quote, what is essential to the identity of each culture. But can culture be reduced to religion? Another important critique of Dols' arguments can be found in a recent edited volume entitled Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean. One of its most important chapters, for our purposes at least, is by Yaron Ayalon, and it's called Religion and Ottoman Society's Responses to Epidemics in the 17th and 18th Centuries. Among many different levels, or on many different levels, I should say, this chapter calls into question Dols' methodology, his assumption, and the soundness of his conclusions regarding European and Middle Eastern responses to the plague. As these criticisms very much continue the evaluations and conversations many of us had on Dols last week, I wanted to share them with you for your own edification and for further enlightenment. Ayalon's essay deals specifically with the question of flight. To cut to the heart of the matter, he's convinced that lots more people in Muslim societies fled plague-afflicted areas than Michael Dols suggests. If you'll remember, of course, Dols argues for a causative relationship between the quote-unquote official Islamic view that this disease was a mercy from God and the decision by most people to stay put within their homes or their local communities when plague arrived. To this, Ayalon asks, but how do we know if the decision not to flee was religiously motivated? What if people couldn't get out of their homes or neighborhoods because they didn't have the money and or other economic resources required to do so? And beyond that, do we even know for a fact that relatively few people fled epidemic areas? In order to answer these questions effectively, we need to think about the sources that Dols and others who've studied the plague in the medieval Middle East use. These tend to be of three types: plague treatises, chronicles, and reports by European visitors. Each of them is problematic for their own reasons. For one, plague treatises are prescriptive. That is to say, they prescribe ideal behaviors. In other words, they tell people what they should do instead of describing people's actual actions. The authors of these treatises also tended to be educated men, all of whom received their training in religious schools. Thus, their outlook was doubtless going to be a pious one. Given this, it's entirely logical to think that the things they were recommending when the plague hit would be religious in nature. Chronicles also have to be interpreted very carefully. These spend a lot of time talking about religious measures, like mass prayers, that Muslims engaged in whenever cases of the plague started popping up in their communities. These sources do give us a sense of what people were actually doing, but they tend to focus exclusively on the behaviors of just one group of people, Muslims. What did Christians and Jews living in parts of Dar al-Islam do? Did they also take part in communal prayers and ceremonies? If they didn't, might that mean that religious beliefs played a less prominent role in shaping people's decisions than historians like Dols suggest? Reports by European visitors are typically quite biased against Muslims. Most of these sources present Muslims as ignorant, uneducated bigots with strange opinions. Europeans also typically saw Muslims as irrational, dogmatic, and superstitiously religious. They believed that their general attitude toward life was one of passive fatalism. Thus, when the plague arrived, and these European visitors saw some people staying in their homes, this was seen as representative of all Muslims' responses to the plague because this confirmed Europeans' pre-existing image of Muslims as slavish devotees of a backward religion that brought only death and destruction. On account of these things, we really can't trust European accounts of the plague's passage through the Middle East. Dols, as most of us pointed out, is convinced that religion was a very potent force in medieval societies, and that it served as the underlying motive behind people's actions when the plague struck. It bears noting that his essay was published in the late 1970s, an era of great religious fervency throughout the Middle East, where theologians in countries like Iran were actively trying to create new states controlled by Islamic religious leaders. Might these realities have been in Dols' mind when he set out to study the plague? Might the saliency of religion in the Middle East of his own day led him to see the 14th century in very similar ways? Perhaps religion was not as important a part of medieval people's identities as we typically have thought. In all likelihood, faith certainly factored into people's decisions about what to do when bubonic plague swept through their communities. But the link between religion and behavior might have been relatively weak compared to other factors. More recently, historians have come to foreground other variables, like those related to economic circumstances or to communal ties and family relationships. Today, it seems like these things had a much bigger impact on people's decisions about what to do in response to the Black Death than has hitherto been realized. As historians increasingly move toward a multifactorial analysis of social responses to the Black Death, we're sure to get even more insights into the impact that this world-altering event had on the lives of countless individuals in their communities who were experiencing it in the 14th century. It is indeed quite an exciting time to be studying the history of the Black Death. All right, well, on that slightly morbid thought, I think I'll sign off and say goodbye for now. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch however works for you. Until next time, everyone, stay safe and stay healthy. Toodles!